All right, so let me tell you that if you read the agenda, the idea was this. It's kind of a discussion I've had with Jeremy now for almost a year now. Jeremy's another one of these guys that early on I kind of looked out for. I saw that he'd done the original Puppet stuff and the net dev, as Colin mentioned earlier, and so I joked that I pinged him on Twitter like 10 times. He ignored me 10 times, and the 11th time he finally responded. But we've had this great conversation about, like, should network people have to code or not code, or, you know, and it's an interesting idea of, you know, how much code should you have to learn? Is it, you know, some of us believe stronger in certain ways, like that it's a software endeavor. IT is software. Andreessen Horowitz says software is eating the world, right? That's one view of the world. But I think we're going to have a good panel here and kind of open this up. So first off, I'm going to let the three gentlemen introduce themselves. So.
Good morning, everybody. I've already introduced myself once. My name's Nathan Sowatskey from the DevNet part of Cisco, where we do developer support. And in particular, we need to speak to people like you to understand what we can provide as a service.
Alex Honor, both from DTO Solutions and SimplifyOps. At DTO, we actually spent a lot of time looking at the life cycle, seeing how applications, products move through it, and networks always come into it. Something that often happens late in the life cycle. I'm also at SimplifyOps, where we help people create self-service. So I think these two things come together for networks.
So my name is Jeremy Schulman. I've been in networking for about 20 years, so I got the jokes JR made. And the last 6 years I was at Juniper Networks, and then 3 years from now, or 3 years back, I started exclusively looking at the problem, how do we automate networks? Because we kind of saw what was going to happen. And I was very fortunate to be a part of the field sales team as well as an engineering team. So my job really was to help sales guys win and close business, but do it in a way that made network automation relevant rather than just selling boxes. And we fell into DevOps kind of by accident, and which resulted in the need to write a Puppet agent. So I was responsible for writing all the Ruby code and working with Puppet Labs. They're just awesome people, and they really helped me through that process. And then we contributed that code back out. We contributed the Ruby gems back out. Those became the foundation for the work that we did with Chef. I then wrote an entire stack of software for Python and Junos, which later we contributed back for the Ansible pieces. So my background was software engineering. You know, I graduated with a CS degree. I did protocol theory and real-time operating system software development for 10 years. I get a lot of what JR was talking about with defensive programming and things of that nature. But, you know, 10 years ago, I switched to be a sales guy, and I kind of, you know, took that hat off. And now we're in a world where that hat has become very relevant. And I saw spending all this time in the DevOps world, not just the cool technology that they had, because it's amazing technology, but really the culture and the community that can build around that in a way that makes not just the tools meaningful, but the whole experience meaningful. And I wanted to bring that experience to networking. And I had to make a very difficult decision about 3 months ago to leave Juniper to start Sprockets, which is the company that these guys are talking about, to bring to networking that which DevOps has done for the server world. And I understand the great things that these server config management tools do, and I understand the real world problems that networking operations guys have. And if anybody's interested and want to do like a little show and tell in the open spaces with Sprockets, I'm more than happy to do that.
That's great. Thanks guys. So I stuck a DevOps guy right in the middle of two network guys, right? So and you know, Alex didn't. One of the things Alex is, you know, didn't tell you is he's done some unbelievable release engineering work with really large web scale companies. I mean, taking some well-branded name downs from 8-hour releases to like 8 minutes, and, you know, some crazy stuff in the way he infrastructure. So he is a true DevOps, like release engineering. So I'm going to start with you, right smack in the middle. You know, to get the ball rolling, should network people have to know how to code?
I think you have to manage networks like code. You know, a lot of times we talk to people in operations, not just networking. That's sort of the first big change the way you need to work is you got to get predictable. People ask for a certain thing and you have to get it predictable. And really the only way to do that is through automation. But I think more than just having automation, I thought that last presentation teed up my next point very well, which is you got to let other groups pull what you do into their own workflow. If you ask for, I need this host name, I need this DNS record, I need this VIP, I need this ACL. These are the common things that always pop up. If that's got to go through somebody's ticket system and scheduled into the rest of their priorities, it's going to take a long time. Those lags cost a lot of money to the business. And most businesses aren't trying to save money on headcount or try to reduce staff. They're really just trying to keep a certain cadence going. And all of these kind of network issues pop up at the worst times, and it just creates a lot of confusion and, unfortunately, some bad feelings about where things need to happen and where these crunch points are. So, it's about setting up environments, usually in the beginning of the life cycle, where you need to get servers or new connection points through in the network. And people try to cope with this right now through meetings and emails and earlier chances in architecture reviews, but those just don't work. Ops people, they're just fewer than there will be dev people. So until you turn it into a service, which kind of sounds silly because network has been a service really from day one, but operated like a service where it's self-serve. And I think that's the real test. And that infrastructure API I thought was a great illustration of the kinds of access that other groups need to consume. And that's a big change, I think, in the way networks are managed today. A lot of times they're managed like what we call snowflakes. They've been put together in place over time. They're very fragile. They're not meant to change quickly, and they need a lot of vetting and a lot of knowledge to know how you change them. And again, that last presentation showed that you can put code behind a specification and really standardize the unit of work. So kind of hidden in what I'm saying is a little bit of lean thinking. Standardizing work is really key to creating velocity and scaling whatever people need from the network.
So Nathan, there's like 8 quadrillion certified Cisco people out here. What do you what do you say about this discussion?
I've been working in the SDN network programming automation space for a couple of years now, since there was in fact such a space in our industry. And I've been spending a lot of time talking to customers, especially in network engineering and ops space. And of course, the idea of having to learn the code in order to further your career is something that's top of mind. But actually, it somewhat misses the point. The key point we keep on hearing is of automation. And clearly, developing code is an important enabler to automate, but it's not the be it and end all of what automation is actually about. What we really need is repeatable processes. I've seen many customers who show me the automation or IT tech they're using for assigning their IP addresses or their masks or what have you, and it's an Excel spreadsheet. It's an Excel spreadsheet. It doesn't even have formulas in it. It's just something they fill in manually that they got from labs, say, that's been handed down to ops, and they have to use this and again manually fill in a template. Now, I do work for a networking company, it's true. Mm-hmm. I have done for over a decade now, but I'm not really from a networking background. I'm really from a software development background, and especially from a software element engineering operations kind of background. And I look at what people are doing, and I'm careful to keep my jaw up and not go, but I feel like going, you're what? What do you, what? I mean, you could do something really simple there with a Python script to actually work out what you're doing. And you could automate that Python script, and you could take these templates, and there's trivial things you could do from a development perspective to do what people are doing manually. And I wouldn't say they're getting it wrong on a continual basis, but they have to work really hard from an organizational point of view in meetings and review and change control boards to make sure they don't get it wrong. And you think of this kind of thing from a development perspective and automation perspective, why are you doing that? Why don't you just write a script that takes a template, a set of IP addresses, and just merges them? That is so basic. It's so basic if you're looking at it from a developer perspective. It's just a bunch of text you're merging with a Python script. But if you're looking at it from a network ops perspective, that's not what people are thinking about. They don't have the mindset of automation. So you need to start from the point of automation. You need to realize that what you're doing day in, day out is a very automatable thing to do. And you frankly have better things to do with your time than to sit down and tell that into a router to find out whether an IP address has been assigned or not. You can just automate that. You have better things to do with your life, better value to offer to your business than to sit down and do these things manually. So it's not about development, it's about automating your approach to what you're doing. And it is a very IT-centric perspective, because people in IT just automate everything they do because they can, and they don't want to do things manually. And that mindset has to be brought into the engineering world. And that's what we're trying to enable here, and this is a conversation that we need to start. It's about automation. Programming's a part of that.
Awesome. Jeremy, you want to, last but not least?
Thank you. So when I looked at what was going on with Puppet, what I took value from what they did was they made automation. We talk about it like this thing exists, like you just automate something or you just write a script or it just happens. Like, it doesn't happen just like that for people that are not doing that every day, right? As a software engineer, I have a certain set of assumptions and approaches that my brain works, right? I just think a certain way. So I can think in terms of automation, but that's not comfortable for a lot of people. And what I looked at what Puppet did is they said, let's take a very complicated task and make an automation tool that makes it consumable for humans to give them superhuman capabilities of automation. And they started with basic tasks, like template building config files. Now, that was the Linux config files. And then they started doing some more sophisticated automation over time. So to answer the question, should network people be programmers? I agree with you, Nathan, that they should first think about a process, like what Colin mentioned. He called it, I call it workflow analysis. You called it a value mapping stream. But what's that? Value stream mapping. But the idea is how can I use a tool to do the simple things, right? And then if you have to write unique Snowflake code because your environment dictates it, then my friend Jason uses a phrase, automate what you can and program what you must, right? And I fundamentally believe that people need to think in the way of approaching infrastructure in an automation way and having the best possible tools out there to do, say, the easy jobs like template building. And then as they learn the process of how to think approaching automation and they get a little bit more practical experience maybe writing some Python or writing some code, having the tool chains out there, whether they're Puppet or Chef or Ansible or what I'm doing with Sprockets, gives you an on-ramp and a vehicle so that you don't have to write all of the code yourself. You're just bolting in your unique value add. And the work that Jeremy Pollard was doing, is Jeremy still here? I think he had to go. Is really inspiring. I see and I hear a lot of these stories where very smart programming people like Jeremy exist in companies and they say, look what I'm doing, this is an awesome use case. And everybody sits in the audience and says, yeah, I want that too. I want to be able to do that, but I don't have 80 hours a day to be a programmer in addition to being 80 hours a day being a network engineer. How can I do these things too without having to build everything from scratch? And that's where there's this gap in the market between all of these APIs that exist between all these different vendors and the need to automate, right? So I think it would be great that everybody would be sophisticated formal language programmers, just like I think it would be great if I was an Iron Chef and I could cook. But I'm not allowed to use anything but the microwave in my house. and it's a time and effort thing.
So if we had one more sponsor, we could have afforded a third mic. So we didn't. So anybody I want people to ask questions now. I hate moderators that ask all the questions. Let's make it interactive. The only thing is you can't be shy. You just got to walk up here. I'm going to hand you the mic to ask the question. But who's up? Come on. Somebody's got to have a question or even comment. I'm going to start picking people.
I mean, I'll start throwing out questions. I mean, to the audience is just, it's like, how many of you, again, raise your hand if you're doing formal language programming, and what I mean by that is Python, Perl, Ruby, you spend more than 50% of your week writing, testing code for other people to use. Okay, not including the vendors that are here. Which okay. So I see 2 hands out of maybe 100. All right. How many of you want to do that? How many of you want to become formal language programmers where you're spending more than 50% of your time writing code for the consumption of others, like what Jeremy's doing? Okay, some more people. Of those people, now keep your hands up real high. Of those people, is your company giving you the time to do that, to come up in that learning process? Are they giving you structured time to essentially learn to be a software engineer or the tools and the techniques? Are they investing in you, or are they saying, hey man, you're the network engineer, there's this thing called SDN, good luck with that, and you need to learn this stuff on your own time. So for the 4 people that raised their hand, I would really like to hear the answer if your company's, I'm seeing one head shake as a no, but anybody else want to talk about this? Because when I read the stories of DevOps, it's all about the environment and the culture that empowers the individual to create the community. And if you're being asked to do something and your environment is not allowing you to do it, I don't know how we break through that log jam, right? So I want to hear your opinion on this.
Say. Oh, yeah, I think they need to come up here. No more lazy questions here.
Nowadays, people program in fancy stuff like Java, JavaScript, Python, Ruby. These 4 are flying. And we also have these traditional programmers programming in C, C++. What drives? I have programmed in a lot of languages, even in EBSTIC, like COBOL and all that, right? So, in my experience, it's the IDE, the familiarity with the IDE that's going to drive all the programming or the enthusiasm to code or solve or,
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we need to, from now on, we need the questions to come up from here.
Finishing of a project, finishing a solution is getting a little complicated because of these object-oriented languages, and IDEs play a big role.
Jeremy, come on up back here. Let's not run back there anymore. All right, because it's just, I don't think anybody even really heard the question. So.
Well, actually, the first thing I was a little surprised about, of the 100 and so people, 7, I counted 7, were interested in using a programming approach to network. So I'm actually curious why the others weren't interested in that, and maybe what alternatives that you might use instead. Or is this just such a whole new thing that, just sort of contemplating the idea? Sorry, I didn't hear everything, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, if you don't mind, it just works better for everybody.
I think that was sort of how the question or how the statement from Jeremy was worded with respect to, are you creating 50% of what you're doing as consumable code for end users? I think if you might have asked different questions around programming, how many of you are interested in learning some amount of, how many of you are interested in learning some amount of programming for doing your network automation? Or nobody? So we lost the 7?
There we go. They're good.
Numbers are going up slightly.
Yeah.
Slightly. Okay.
And by the way, Kurt has a great, he does the Python training for network engineers. It's pretty amazing. So you might want to seek him out, on the break or in the open spaces. But go ahead. Yeah, you're talking to Mike. Yeah. It just doesn't.
So the reason why I set like 50% and why I said, consumption for others, because really when we're talking about this culture of change, you have to consider that you're not writing code just for you. You might be starting out that way, right? But it really is, as Jeremy Pollard said, the consumption of everybody else so that you get out of the way and you are no longer that critical resource or constraint. What I wanted to hear from the DevOps gentleman, Alex, was, when we think about the DevOps guys, maybe these are this mysterious group behind a curtain. How much time do they spend programming either formal language or automation through tools? Because when people in networking, they say, I'm too busy to write code or learn to code because I'm so busy bailing the boat, or keeping the lights on. I'm trying to, maybe 50%, Kurt, is fair to say that was too high. But when the DevOps guys do this, how much time do they devote to this task versus other tasks in their day-to-day job?
I'll talk about what I would recommend from a DevOps approach, and that is, I think you used the word constraint, very well there, and that is find the constraint in the delivery process. So I heard somebody mention value stream mapping. That kind of got me a little excited because that's how I see, where the work flows. It's a good way to visualize where the work flows. But really, what it's great for is finding bottlenecks in how the work flows. So, it's not really about just programming and writing tools. Actually, I'm more of a software guy, if I have to admit it. I like writing software. I think writing software is fun. I've written software that didn't need to be written. I've written software that was going overboard for what was needed. And it's easy to do if you like writing tools. So, there's almost a trap here. It's not just programming. It's not just using a software discipline. Those things are important, but it's really about seeing where in the flow of work do you need to make something easier for the upstream people to consume it and make it verifiable for the downstream people to know it's going to work. So, we use the supply chain metaphor a lot in this kind of conversation. There's people in the data centers, they're racking and stacking. There's people who are cabling it. There's people who are, giving it IP addresses and host names. There's all these things down the line. Finally, you get to a deployment somebody wants to make in QA or production. And these things happen every day for every project. So, where in that stream could you make it easier so that it goes down smoother and doesn't surprise somebody? Because the typical things that we see when we're value stream mapping is, why did I not get this thing in DNS? How come nobody told me to make this ACL request earlier? Why do I not understand how to give you the information to create a VIP? It's these kind of boring pieces of information that we heard from the last presentation that slow the whole thing down. So I think if you have a critical eye, that's the better way to look at it. Where can you make the work flow smoother? And that to me has always been the greatest guide to how you change the way to work in a DevOps style. A lot of times that makes tooling and automation somewhere in the process, but the supply chain view, I think, kind of helps you, see how it connects.
Well, and that to that point, Edward Deming. So I'm a big fan of lean Toyota production systems. Right? To Alex's point about the flow. I mean, one of the coolest things is when the Japanese and Toyota production systems were building cars way better than we were in the 80s. A bunch of people from like Ford and GM went over to try to figure out what's going on. And they noticed at the end of the assembly line, when they put the door in, they didn't have to hit mallets to fit it in. And they couldn't understand why that was. They were like, how come you don't have to force fit it in? And the manufacturer of the Toyota production system people were like, why would you ask that question? That was solved way down the line. Right? So it's thinking like that becomes, we've learned a lot in DevOps from Toyota production systems, and I think the network people, you can learn a lot by understanding lean. And I think, Omar, you wanted to come up and, come on, grab the mic. Yeah, and again, if you got a question, it might be cool to queue up or something like that. Yeah, I mean, it's only fun if you're interactive, really, so.
So another old networking guy, so I understood JR's comments about vampire taps. So I think we approach the conversation with networking folks wrong, to be honest. Over the years, I've had to learn about voice. I've had to learn about wireless. I've had to learn about power and cooling. And certainly not enough to be an electrical engineer, but enough to understand how many catalysts I can jam into a rack and not melt something down. I think sometimes the programmer side, the dev side, has a lot of passion, and frankly, it scares the hell out of networking people, because it gets teed up as something that is tangential to their day job. And if that's the way you approach it, I think then you're looking at it wrong. It should be about, okay, how can I use automation? How can I use scripting? How can I use Python to help be more efficient? I mean, another nod to the value stream mapping. It's fancy word, $5 word for kind of looking at how you turn up a switch or map a VLAN and where are you wasting your time, or where you're doing something repetitious that can get automated, and trying to shift the conversation to make it part of your daily job, and not being, okay, this is my daily job, and I'm going to go over here and do DevOpsy stuff. I think if we're trying to pull people into the community, it can't be that conversation, because frankly, no one has the time to work, learn Python on the weekends. They'd rather be drinking beer and watching ball games, and that's probably the right set of priorities. And I think as we go to engage, I think kind of keep that piece in mind. As we get, networking folks get painted as old and scarred and intransigent. I don't think that's the case. If you really look at what anyone with any kind of meaningful career has, and the things they've had to adapt to, whether it's technologies cloud or whatever. It's there, but I think folks are very opportunistic, and they'll learn just enough to be able to do their day job. And I think sometimes folks have a hard time connecting Python or Ruby or value chain mapping with, I got to get like these 3 switches turned up in Dubuque on Tuesday.
Well, yeah, let's do counterpoints, then you're next on a question.
One of the interesting conversations I had about a year ago at an ONF event fairly nearby was with one of my colleagues explaining that the customer perspective of the people he worked with was entirely anti-automation. He was talking to network engineers and operators who are very used to the idea of being directly hands-on and fully engaged with what was happening in their network. If they needed to configure it and they needed to debug it, they knew how to do that via the CLI. And if anything got between them and what they understood, that is a black box they saw as automation, they wouldn't accept it. They didn't even do automated basic config management. I mean, the idea of actually creating more automation or doing anything else around that space, they wouldn't do it because it got between them and what they were responsible for. And what they understood and what they knew how to do was configure and debug networks using CLI. And they just weren't going to go down the automation path because they didn't understand it, they couldn't control it, but they were going to be held responsible for the outcome. So how many people here relate to that point of view? I've got one at the back there. So no one else, okay, it's 1 or 2. Okay. But this is real. If you don't understand it and you can't control it, but you're being held responsible for the outcome, you're in a really, really difficult position. So when we're thinking about do people need to learn programming, what I most normally explain, it's not that you need to learn programming, is that you need to understand that this is something that you can understand, you can control, and you can contribute to, even if you're not actually the person writing the code or building the automation. And the flip side of this, of course, is that specific customer that was being talked about, they couldn't scale their business. They couldn't ramp up. They couldn't get fingers on keyboards to take them where they needed to be. And that was a dead end for them. So it's not even that you have to think about automation. If you're going to scale up your ability to run a network, like people have scaled up their ability to deploy servers and services in a data center, then you need to think about what's the most important thing for you to spend your time on. And it's important things for you to spend your time on are intellectual design and value creation. And you need to accept that those things you can't, therefore, spend your time on is fingers on keyboards using CLI to debug what's happening in the network, because that's not going to be something that works for your business anymore. And that's what people are beginning to think about. It's becoming an imperative from the business perspective.
I'd like to add on a little bit to that, because I have been in shops on the server side where there's been efforts to automate the provisioning of servers. So the tooling there is pretty mature. I'd say very mature now. And so you'd think that that part's well understood and approachable and easy to get started with. But I've seen where somebody's automated the provisioning of all the roles for the stack they have. But when it came to deploy, because of scheduling reasons or something else that came up late in the cycle, they pushed it out by hand. And they pushed it out by hand because they had to meet a deadline and because there was a fear that the servers they'd been maintaining the old way, I call the snowflake way, the managed in place way, was going to get out of sync with their knowledge and get clobbered by this automation. So guess what happens? The automation starts going stale, it starts drifting apart from how it's going to make the servers, and then nobody wants to use the automation, and that code is old and then doesn't get used anymore. Automation project failure. And so you could say it's sort of a lack of commitment to pushing it all the way through, but there's almost kind of a death spiral that's easy to fall into. The more afraid you are of your infrastructure because it's got all those little idiosyncrasies, because you made the change in place, the more complicated it is, the harder those boring questions are to answer by the devs. What IP address should I be using? What DNS zone should this be in? Whatever it is, you're just making the environment more and more complex just from an information standpoint, that the hole gets harder and harder to dig out. So, I think a lot of people may feel that way. It's the core network. Nobody can change it. I've got access control policies to manage here. These are reasons not to do it, but I think that presentation we saw earlier shows that it can be done. And I think, how you chip away at it is maybe unique to each one of you, but that's really the only way you're going to get in. You'll be in charge of your infrastructure when you manage it like code.
All right, Eddie Arcuri from Juniper Networks. So far we've talked a lot about, all the work that all of us in the room get to do. But what have you seen the vendors doing or not doing that could really contribute to allow automation of their devices more?
Speaking as a vendor, I could go on and list a lot of technologies, and I could talk about technologies like plug and play, which we can bring up the switches and routers. It's an open protocol, which is recent development. I could talk about APIs like 1PK. I could talk about a whole range of different controllers. I could talk about developer.cisco.com. And all of these things are happening. These are efforts I've been intimately involved in for the last couple of years. And we're continuing to build on some of those, and some didn't work out. We've learned a lot over the last couple of years from what we have been trying in its embryonic stage. We're putting a lot of effort through DevNet into building automation services and capabilities, supporting SDKs and APIs, and building up our strength to support a developer community around this space. The last couple of years have been a real learning experience, really. What is it that people want to do in automation? What is it that people do want to do in programming? And what do people not want to do in automation and programming? And we've used that as a platform to give us a sense of what you, our customers, are actually prepared to invest in and use. And we've been surprised with some ideas we thought were really cool, didn't take off at all. Other ideas we'd never thought of at all came out of left field, that's right field, or left field, and surprised us entirely. The next 6 months we'll see a lot of effort going into building capabilities at DevNet to support developer experiences around the network space. There'll be a lot of new products coming out and a lot of new technologies. All I can say is watch this space, but most importantly, don't just watch it, actually come and tell me what you want, and not just me, but also my colleagues. When John and Dave and I started talking about this event back in June, the main motivating factor was to have a conversation about what people actually want to do in this space. And we're putting in the infrastructure and the services and the capabilities to support that, but if you don't actually come and tell us what you want, and it's a very new area, and it's kind of difficult to say what you want when you don't know what you can do, so you've got a chicken and egg situation here, but you have to come and talk to us about it. And hopefully some of you will, and we'll get a sense to build out what you actually need.
So I'm going to put my old Juniper hat on and answer that question a little bit. And this goes back to the DevNet. One of the critical elements that is missing for people who want to get started with automation and automating the network is a safe environment to practice, right? Kind of I'm not going to screw up the network if I try to write to an API, that kind of a thing. A virtual environment like DevNet, for example, or Juniper has Junosphere, or Cumulus, you can download a virtual machine, and so forth with Arista. Most of the vendors are starting to come out with virtualized technology that allows you a safe harbor, essentially, to practice. I think this is an exciting time for networking because we're starting to see more and more of this. So that's what I think you should expect from vendors. The other thing that I think you should expect from vendors, and when we say vendors, I'm assuming you mean traditional networking vendors like a Cisco and a Juniper, is that they are starting to produce what I call component technology. These are libraries, right? So at Juniper, I mentioned, we built a Ruby library and a Python library that allows the use of APIs on a box in a better consumable way, right? And I think we're starting to see some of that with Arista and Cisco, and these component technologies are all over the board in terms of maturity and usability. So as customers, I encourage you to force feedback information to the vendors and say, look, I'm new to automation. I don't even know how to tell you whether or not I think your API is good or bad, but I need you to demonstrate how I, as a non-programmer, would use and consume this technology, because until you make the technology consumable, it has no value, right? And so I think that's an element of what I would expect from vendors, what I'm hoping from vendors. And like JR said earlier this morning, I'm very excited that they're starting to put structured I/O abstractions in a Linux environment because, from my perspective, that's what we need in a Linux environment to make it consumable, because managing a disparate set of files and processes and all these packages of software is not the way networking people generally think about, managing an infrastructure. We're used to the CLI experience. We like that feedback experience, and we need to start with something that we're comfortable with.
I don't know anything about what tooling exists for automating network provisioning, but I will say this. The key isn't just to create the automation to provision it and create a deeper silo for what you do. The rest of the organization needs visibility into how things are built and how new things will be built. So, that could be in a source code form, but developers want to know why things are the way they are. And it's not just because they want to know, it's because they want to know how to ask questions better so that they can, get the thing through the cycle quicker. So that would be my only guidance, that make it visible.
Hey, there we go. Mike Gibbs, Verisign. So going back to the CLI thing, I think probably a good amount of these people, or network engineers, have learned via pounding the CLI, right? So there has been some fear that as you automate the provisioning side, their skill sets of working there gets lost, right? Because they don't have as much experience on there for troubleshooting. But that gets to the second thing. As you tool, as you do more automation, how do you deal with the troubleshooting side, right? Because if I jump on to go fix something, I'm going to have config drift, right? And how do you deal with that as you go along? Because we talked a lot about provisioning, but how do you do it on the future care and feeding?
Yeah, excellent question. So I think there's two questions in that I'll try to hit on, right? One was, I understand the CLI of a box, right? And really, what I see as the core network knowledge is they not only know the CLI, but they know what they're doing, right? They have in their mind a workflow or a process. They have a flow chart in their mind. They might not have written it down, but it's in their mind, right? So there's one element that says, I'm making a configuration change, which is essentially a CLI set of changes. It's very easy for a networking person to take that template or that configuration and turn it into a template. It's effectively a mail merge, right? So the fear of somebody saying, I'm going to lose my job if I use automation, is a real farce, because somebody still has to write those templates, the configuration, and only they know what that is, or the people who are knowledgeable, right? What they don't have is the easy button that says, mail merge this YAML file of data into a template. That can be solved with tooling. Maybe they don't even have to write that tooling, right? The second element I'm glad you really brought up, because in my opinion is the harder problem, which is not how do I template build config changes, but how do I actually operationally get insight into my network that is actually a distributed application. This is very, very hard to do, right? And this is part of the reason, again, why I started Sprockets, was to address this. But the essence of it is somebody has to understand their workflow, as both of these gentlemen have said. These are the tasks that I want to do. And then you don't have to automate every single operational set of tooling. You pick the ones that are easy, meaning if you were to write a flow chart out, why don't you write out one that doesn't have a lot of if-then-elses, like just a nice linear pipeline. And then you can make that something that you could automate. And then you just start with those, and you start, as he says, chip away. And over time, what you might find is the basic things that you do every day are simple linear pipelines, and that might give you 60% of your day back, so that you can start thinking about the other things that need to be done. And maybe the other things you don't automate. Maybe you still have to be on the CLI to do the hard things. But I always tell people to get started on the simple tasks that are the low-hanging fruit, to get their feet, get their feet wet and get experience in it. But as we get APIs, these devices become more automatable, so you can take those linear tasks and start the operational, getting the situational awareness out of the box, so that you can do those types of, I'm going to make a config change, let me see the result of that. I'm going to make a different config change, let me see the result of that.
More questions coming, so I'll answer that one briefly by another customer experience. Yes, people are very used to using a CLI, but it doesn't mean they like it. I was giving a training session to one set of customers, and half of them were paying attention, and half of them couldn't pay attention because they had to go and trivial tasks because they had to find out whether an IP address was assigned. And the only way they could find out whether that IP address was assigned was to actually log into every router and check every interface to find out whether it had that IP address. And I was talking to them about how they could automate simple things like that. So yes, people are really used to using CLI. That's the only way they know how to do it. When I showed these guys how to write a script, they simply log into every device, look at every interface, and check whether it had a given IP address. They used that. And that took about 10 minutes to get them off the manual process onto a very simple Python script that just logged into every box and checked the interface. People understand that they have a certain skill set, and they've spent a lot of time learning about how to build very complex network systems. And until fairly recently, the only way they had of expressing that knowledge was CLI, which for a lot of people was and remains a very, very frustrating thing. Huge body of knowledge, tiny little keyhole of CLI to express that body of knowledge through. The body of knowledge doesn't go away, but you can certainly do a lot more with it if you can start taking it and actually applying it through forms of automation. It doesn't have to be end-to-end automation. There's simple things you can do that save time. Your job doesn't go away, your skills don't go away, but you can do a lot more with it if you're not forced to be using CLI for everything you need to do.
Hello. Sorry, I'm going to make a quick comment. Like, so, you know, this whole discussion about like this being new and the CLI. 8 years ago, when I was going around trying to get people to use systems operations guys, and the only difference between them and CLI was awk and grep, right? Because it was a CLI, and they were pretty ornery about the whole discussion about building an abstraction layer. So we make it sound like it's simple now, and the ops guys all get it now. However, the network people are going to figure this out? Again, 8 years ago. Like, I have scars, and there was a couple of times I felt like I had to run out of the building because somebody was going to beat me up, right? Alex, I mean.
Yeah, I kind of, I picked out my interest also. You know, there's a test. If you have to log into a box, you're doing it wrong. I don't know who said that first, but, you know, that came from the sysadmin world. It just meant that you're managing things in place, and it's not going to be repeatable. And if you want to get ahead of the game, that means you need to drive it from some kind of tool, some kind of repeatable process. So I think that litmus test applies just as well in anything, and I think it would be for any kind of network infrastructure.
Some of the points that I had in mind, you gentlemen have already addressed, particularly one of the big issues is the apparent or perceived fear. What is automation going to do to my job? The other one is the lack of certain avenues when you have a tremendous amount of knowledge, but you only have one tool called a CLI, right? But underlying many of these, at least in the space of carrier networks, which I am personally a lot more interested in. And if I compare that to what happens in the computing world in general, there is one of the things that enables DevOps in the computing world is the prevalence of some notion of standardization. Linux, for instance, Ethernet switching in data centers, and so on and so forth. But the moment you transplant this into the carrier world, it is an extremely complex network of bespoke systems. And this underlying construct in itself is a huge impediment to DevOps. What suggestions might you have in this space?
That's absolutely true. Sometimes we say, legacy is nothing but the history of success, and that's basically things built up over time. Because some sales guy promised some crazy idea, with some crazy change schedule and all this exotic stuff at that time. And so that's what you're left with now. How you clean that up is not easy. Yeah, I think, you have to think about what are the routine tasks that come up all the time as your guide to choose what you're going to try to standardize. It might not mean that you can standardize the configuration with that existing environment. It just might mean the way you standardize how work gets done and make it visible to your users, the people who are asking for these things. When it's greenfield, then I think, I thought that box network example is the best example that I've heard so far in what's possible and how far you can standardize things, through algorithms and through, standard specifications. But again, I kind of go back to the workflow because to me that's what's driving your day-to-day, your interruptions. Try to standardize that workflow first, and then how you chip away at your legacy infrastructure might be based on what your team's capable of doing through software approaches and also what the vendors are giving you in terms of tooling.
Yeah, I mean, but you asked a really good question, which is the fear factor, right? I think you asked, are networking people afraid of automation because they think they're going to lose their job? Did I hear that right? How did the DevOps guys get over that problem?
Well, I think John said some of them chased him out of the conference rooms. I think I was right behind him running. It takes time. It's a cultural change. I was doing system administration a long time ago, and I had servers that I would visit, and I liked writing programs, so it wasn't just that, programming was a weird thing. It was just the way of working. You get used to your systems. You get used to your infrastructure. They're kind of like, your family or your friends. You've visited them so many times. You know how they all are. They're all unique individuals, and I don't know, maybe it makes you feel good. But, in the end, you got to treat them like cattle, not pets. They're just all things you got to, refactor and do variable things.
The next question will probably be equally as good as the others, but how do people cope with the thought that more automation will put them out of a job? And actually, that isn't how it turns out at all. The business is always going to be asking more of people in IT and operations than they have the capacity to deliver. The business is always going to want to be able to create more services, deliver those services to more customers, scale across more geographies than you have the capacity to deliver. You're always chasing the business's demands. You're always trying to meet what the business wants to do. The business is almost always saying, why on earth can't you? Why do we have to do it next year? And the answer is because you can't scale up in the operations side, and you can't scale up doing things manually. So no, you won't lose a job if you automate. You'll just get more work to do. And when you automate that, you'll get yet more work to do. And just when you think you're giving the business what it wants, they'll give you something else to do too. So you probably won't be losing your job here.
The other question that I think you asked was, how do we deal with the disparate nature that networking is not Linux, or there's no real uniform layer? And this really goes to what JR said earlier. There is no uniform data model, right? And this is, again, what I saw in networking, where every networking vendor is different, right? They have a different set of APIs, they have a different set of capabilities, and then we have different knowledge domains, like service provider, WAN, is a different knowledge domain and has a different set of problems than, say, data center rack scaling, like you might find in that world. And my thought on that was, we need to have better tools that deal with this, what I call the architecture of disagreement, meaning, vendors are not all going to get together and agree on one set of APIs, which is, again, why I created Sprockets to address that specific nature. And if you look at tools like Puppet and Chef, they took a great approach to that abstraction mechanism and empowered people to use abstractions to create that uniform layer, right? So these are ideas that we need to bring to networking, right? But like the other gentleman said, it isn't just about config management, right? It's all about operational, situational awareness in a highly distributed, multi-staged network. So there are elements that are really amazing from DevOps, but we need to bring them to NetOps. We have to bring that to our world in our own ways.
Probably getting to everybody here. So I think we'll do one more question, and then we'll go ahead and break for lunch. So here you go.
So my question is about DevOps. Is very simple. About DevOps, in terms of DevOps, what is most important in terms of how to automate, when to automate, and what to automate?
Yeah, I'll go back to what I was saying earlier. Automate what you get asked for the most. I mean, maybe it sounds obvious, but there's cooler things to automate that might be distracting you. So really just getting out of everybody's critical path, to me, would be your guide to what you should automate. And it may be really simple stuff. I mean, I've been in large enterprises where they give you self-service ACL, provisioning. Not a very big project, but, as far as the release process went, it was critical, and it just saved so much time and back and forth with a lot of other groups. So, sometimes it's just simple little, routines like that. How would you provision a whole new, network and get all your security and all that? That's harder project, but people aren't asking for that very much. That's when you're building a new data center. So maybe it's just starting simpler than what you could be doing. It's not to boil the ocean. It's really just getting the routine stuff out of your lap.
Yeah, I like that. Focus on what's important and straightforward and obvious. And you have to start with things that you're feeling comfortable with and that are important from the perspective of the business. What are you being asked to do constantly that's taking too long from the business's perspective? Focus on that. Clearly valuable because people are asking for it. Don't start with trying to boil the ocean. You don't have to automate everything end to end, and it's probably not safe to do so. But if you're doing very simple things that people keep on asking for, automate it. Get it out of your life, do it easily, and then move on from there. It becomes obvious in a business context what you need to focus on. And as you grow that capacity and as you become comfortable with it, you can start expanding and building your ability to extend automation. But keep it simple at the beginning.
Yeah, one of the things that I learned when I was at Juniper and I was doing essentially automation architecture for the sales guys, like I'd go and meet with customers, I would, in effect, do a very lightweight version of what Colin was describing on very hard PowerPoint, right? Which was, show me the process that you're doing end to end, even outside the boundaries of your silo, right? And that was a process that I would take them through, and we would figure out, well, what are the obvious things? Because honestly, if you, in a lot of the conversations I had with customers, I would say, well, what do you want to automate? And they said, we don't know. Like, they wouldn't know what was obvious to them because it's not something they think about every day like you and I would. So if you find yourself in that position where you don't know what you want to automate, I would highly encourage you to reach out to Colin or companies like Colin that could come in and help you through that process, or anybody that can help you through that process. Lean on your networking, sales team, see if they have somebody that can help you through that process. Because what I found that's obvious to me and what is obvious to somebody else that has a different mindset are very, very different things, right? And so this obviousness bit, I think people need help with, and I think we need more people to help them along, whether in a formal capacity like what Nexus might do on a professional basis, or just leaning on your sales and engineering staff from your vendors.
Actually, we got a bonus time because they said I need about 5 more minutes to set up the food. So I'm going to do, I haven't done any real shout outs, but I do this DevOps Cafe podcast on iTunes, and my partner in crime here is going to ask from a DevOps perspective a question.
Yeah. Yes, my question, you guys mentioned about the trust between development and operations and knowing where to start or how to know you're done with the automation. This is a softball question to Alex because he's a colleague of mine. So here you go. Verification tests. You talk about coming to an organization and before you automate anything, talking about thinking from a test-driven mentality, how you use verification tests to improve the relationship between development and operations. How do you actually get started doing something like that? Can you talk about that idea?
Yeah, I feel like I got an easy hit there. So we always talk about thinking of DevOps like a supply chain. There's all these disciplines, network, systems, database, InfoSec, software development, you name it. You know all these people. And they're all interconnected by their work. So, one of the best things you can do to make the network side of that is to give verifiable tests. Because if you think of it as supply chain, how do you know you're done? Well, you ran your test that showed that you were successful in meeting whatever your objectives were for that change. Well, that thing is a great handoff tool to give to the people that use your service. Maybe this is the systems people here, that they can repeat that same test and they'll know, yes, it's meeting the acceptance criteria. So I think that type of thinking is not necessarily an automation question, but it gets you towards the automation because it starts asking, what are the things that I externally test? What can I observe? What can I use to the CLI? What could I write a script that when I run uses that CLI or whatever interface that the vendor or the tooling gives you, to know that it's meeting my, my expectations. I think that goes a long way.
How many people here are familiar with the concept of agile development? Okay, good. Everybody knows what the definition of done is then, yes? Right. So done is when you've passed all your tests, you've got 100% code coverage, all the documentation is there. So the concept of a definition of done is fairly well understood in the agile development world, and it's equally applicable for any form of automation. So when you're talking about an end-to-end automation concept, you're going to have tests, you're going to have criteria, objective criteria that have to be met to demonstrate that you've actually achieved what it is you set out to do. And in fact, the hardest part of automation at the end of the day is knowing what the definition of done is going to be. Actually doing automation becomes relatively straightforward once you've figured out what done means, and being able to define that, both in terms of automated testing, in terms of have you passed your code review, is your config correct, is your config deployed, etc. That's the key part. To think about what done means, and then the natural definition of what it means to achieve done is what guides your automation.
Yeah, and I'm just going to echo what you guys said, which is, visibility creates trust, right? And I think most of the time in networking, there's a mistrust between these barriers between, say, dev and ops, or network engineering and network ops. There's always that mistrust. The network engineering guy said, we built all these MOPs, methods and procedures. We threw them over to ops. You talk to the ops guys, they say those engineers, they tested it in a lab. They're not in the real world. They don't get it. They have to tweak and change it. So that interface point is where there is mistrust. And if you're going to build automation, then it has to be consumable by both sides so that they can test what they're doing and retain that trust. And over time, I think, as they trust that every time they do X, they get Y back, then I think that fear goes away. I think it just takes time and building of trust. But visibility creates trust. The transparency creates trust. The one thing that one of my friends talks about a lot is this hero culture that we have in the networking world where, somebody wants to own it, they want to pet their switch or be on the CLI. I think that the DevOps guys got away from the hero culture, and that is a critical element of the DNA that I think we have to get away from in networking. We have to say, I am no longer the center of the universe. I'm here to help my peers, not to be the hero all the time. And I think that's, again, an element of trust, because if you're always worried about Bob going on vacation or Bob getting hit by a bus, or we always hear about Bob, this guy Bob, right? I used to wake up every day at Juniper going, I'm trying to put myself out of a job, in the sense that I'm trying to empower everybody around me so I'm no longer the critical path, because I knew that there was more work than I could ever handle, ever. So you have to start that mindset, and that's a fear factor even internally for people to say, well, I want to be important to my job. I fear for my job, and if I think, maybe I should not think that way, is really hard for a lot of people to get through that mental hurdle.
Brilliant point on ending on, because, if we don't like pets, we really hate heroes. Literally. One of my early baptisms was a gentleman named Chris Reed, who I could go back maybe in open space, give you a little bit of history of his background. But I got to visit him early on and what he was doing. And it was cool because this guy knew everything about everything. And when the young guys came up to him, he wasn't go read the manual. And I watched him throughout the day where they'd come up and he'd just spend as much time as he could with the junior guys. And I was like, well, that's really cool. He said, no, it helps me. The more I train these people and these girls and gals, it just makes things better. So the hero thing is really, you've been asking all along, what of the DevOps scene? Let's kill the heroes, right? There's no place for heroes in the world we're going into. With that, we have lunch. One more thing before you jump up.